Welcome to the Expanding Consciousness podcast with your hosts, Michael Wally and Nicholas Haag. In this podcast, we explore ways to sharpen our awareness, make life more enjoyable, be a little kinder, become more authentic, less reactive, more present, and ultimately expand our consciousness. We're happy to have you along for the ride, and if you do enjoy these conversations, please leave a review or a comment, as this goes a long way for us. Enough of the promotional talk and enjoy this episode.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. This week we're talking about a pretty relevant topic for both of us. Going through some stuff over here, and that's self-care. Like how say you're having a very intense emotional experience. What do you do to ground yourself, to come down, to take care of yourself after that? So what's been helpful for you, Nick?
What's been helpful for me, first of all, has been learning to give myself the space and to acknowledge that I'm not feeling fully 100%. If I'm going through something emotionally, I mean, even if it's just on a body level, like I'm sick, I used to really push out recovery time. I used to not take days sick at work, go in even if I have a cold. If I had emotional problems, I would never speak to anybody about that. I would still, always try to still perform, do all my duties, go to work, and all of this stuff, which is obviously not really healthy, which doesn't help with healing. It doesn't help with getting further. So the big lesson for me first was to learn to acknowledge when I'm not feeling well, that I need recovery time, that it's important, and that I cannot act my best if I don't take those times off. So yeah, I think I reached a point where I'm a bit more practical with this now, and I allow myself also to take time off. I don't feel bad anymore about it. I really used to, guilt trip myself for taking off time at work, and really stupid stuff like that, which I assume are just some kind of like childhood patterns of not wanting to let other people down, always be there for people. There's also patterns like not wanting to ask for help from other people. All these kind of things play into into getting unhealthy behaviors like that. So I hope that I'm now on a better path. And yeah, so that's my first go-to thing is, okay, allow myself to take some time off. And then what really helps, honestly, is comfort. I mean, as stupid as it sounds, usually the body knows how to take care of both physical and emotional problems, and sometimes it just takes some time and space. And what really helps is, allow yourself to be also comfortable. We all the time try to go out there and be uncomfortable, lean into uncomfortableness, expand our comfort zone, all of these things. But sometimes when you get the clear signs from your body that you need a break, then really take a break and really allow yourself also some comfort. And that can come in any form or shape. I mean, everybody knows best what is comfortable for them. For me, it's like taking baths, I don't know, sometimes laying in bed, binge watching some TV shows, all that kind of stuff. Or as we mentioned before, like maybe greasy food. Usually I try to really watch out what I eat. I try to put healthy stuff in my body. But then, allow yourself to also step out there for a minute and just be comfortable. Yeah, that's my
Yeah,
go-to method.
yeah,
How about
yeah.
you?
I really love what you were saying there at the beginning, especially around first recognizing that you need some time, that you need some self-care, and giving yourself this excuse me, and giving yourself the space. It's taken me a long time, and I'm still, honestly in the process of learning to do that for myself. But yeah, much like yourself, I, would beat myself up and force myself to go to work or whatever, and ignore my emotional problems. And Yeah, I see that very much so as very culturally driven. Kind of being raised as like, well, certainly as a guy, there's this tendency to not give yourself space for your emotions, and anytime that that's disruptive, it's just like treated as an inconvenience, and you really just kind of crack the whip with yourself and just like, just get back to work, you're fine, walk it off or something. And these types of issues, when they arise, are not something that you can really just walk off or push yourself through. I mean, you can, right, to some degree, but eventually you kind of have to pay the toll. You eventually have to pay your dues. And so yeah, for myself, right now, currently, I've been taking a little bit of time off of work, and I'm uh, working on taking a little bit more time, hopefully getting like a leave of absence. And just that process of you know standing up for myself in that regard has been very challenging, but also very valuable in terms of my personal growth. Like, I never would have done this before, and now that I have the wherewithal, now that I have the self-awareness to really say that, okay, this is something that I clearly need right now. Now I'm going through the trouble of kind of trying to convince other people of it's what I need. And so there's that aspect, right? But in terms of just taking care of yourself and some of the more practical things, yeah, comfort is such a valuable one, and it's a little bit different for everyone, but there's a lot of commonality there. Myself, I've been doing a lot of showers and baths and have found those to be like very sort of like cleansing of the emotions. Really, it's interesting how water, in that regard, can kind of help almost wash away some of the emotional residue. So yeah, definitely a lot of baths for me. And yeah, some mindless TV, honestly, can be very helpful. I mean, I definitely try to be gentle with the intensity of the content, but maybe just some mindless cartoons or something, and throwing that on in the background and spending some time with my cats. Your pets tend to be pretty good, helping you soothe yourself. And yeah, just making myself like a little pillow fort or something, and diving in and just kind of relaxing. That's kind of been my go-to for the unwinding aspect of it and taking care of myself. And like yourself, food can also be very helpful. Sometimes eating a little bit on the heavier side. I was mentioning before the podcast how oftentimes in you know various different spiritual traditions, there's this tendency to go for like high pranic foods, very very light, vegetarian, raw, and that stuff really works really well. But when you're in a place where you need more grounding, where you need to kind of calm your system down, you almost want to go the opposite direction. You almost want to eat the heavier, the greasier things, because that can really help ground you as well. But yeah, that's kind of been my approach. I'm sure I'm missing a few things, but we'll get around to it.
Yeah, some speculation regarding the heavy food would be that I know that if we eat high carb meals, it I think it hits also our opioid reactors, neurons. I meant, and yeah, that basically releases that, or it instantly calms down our nervous system, right? It would like be like taking an opioid pill, basically, just in a natural form, and obviously it calms down the nervous system. And if we have an intensely calm nervous system or a very calm nervous system, I guess that also helps with emotional regulation. If we're going through something emotional, obviously that helps with any kind of emotional rut and just brings in calmness to the system. So I don't know, that would be my guess why it helps. With the water element that you're mentioning, I know that in Bali there's these rituals of, you go to waterfall and you cleanse in the waterfall. And I think various civilizations always had rituals with water. Ancient Rome, ancient Greece, it was always an important element. I absolutely love, like, one of the best things I can do, even if I'm like starting to get a little sick,
Hmm.
is sauna. For some reason, sauna and cold plunges. So anything related to that somehow seems to push my body to heal quicker and give that extra bit of comfort. That really helps a lot. I was wondering though, because we touched on the fact that it's somehow difficult to allow yourself to take the time off, because if anything, it's an inconvenience for the system, right? If we're being sick, maybe with for women it might be already somehow expected at least once a month. They're they're gonna go through a cycle and have a phase where they're not gonna feel 100%. But for men especially, I think it's just expected that you
Yeah.
work like clockwork all around the time, that you're not going through any kind of emotional cycles. So it's a major inconvenience, if we get sick, or if we have an emotional rut, or if we just don't feel 100%. And then it's difficult to claim that space and that need for space in that situation. And I was wondering why that happens, because on the other hand, when somebody else approaches me, somebody who's dear to me, and says they don't feel well, you know, the first thing I would do is recommend them, really take the time off, take all the space that you need. Please do rest. Please get better. I would try to do anything for the people I love, so that they feel that they're able to recover quickly. Yet, when it happens to me, I have this whole negotiation in my mind, and I need to verify 10 times that really what I'm going through is as bad that I need to take a break. And I thought that's kind
Mhm.
of interesting. And I was wondering, like, why is it that shouldn't we have the relationship to ourselves the same way that we have to people that we love? And why do we hesitate, in the relationship with ourselves? Why is the relationship with ourselves not the same like the relationship with other
Yeah,
people that we
yeah,
love?
that's a really good question. Definitely something I've been, personally trying to navigate a lot recently, just because there is so much internal resistance to really first even acknowledge that there's something significant going on within me that's making it extraordinarily difficult to do what I would otherwise be doing. But then also to kind of cut yourself the slack. I think, hmm, you know, I hate to use culture as the scapegoat all the time, but I feel like it is sort of like a culturally ingrained thing. Like, almost we treat ourselves more like machines, and we're expecting, like, "Oh, well, you just need a little tune up here, or do this," and then you just kind of go right back to it, and we don't really mm, treat ourselves with that same level of care. But it is interesting how we're able to do that for other people, because I mean, I totally relate. When there's a coworker who seems to be going through something, there's no hesitation around helping them or giving them the space, right? There's no second guessing it. But when it comes to myself, it's like, okay, well, I need proof. It's almost like, I need to prove to myself that this is true, that this is really happening. I need something outside of my own psyche and outside of my own determination, which it is really weird. Uh, I don't have a clear answer for that. I'm curious. Do you have any, like, speculation around, I mean, of course, childhood stuff, but, I hate to just dismiss it like that.
Yeah, it is. I guess it has something to do with self-love, and the fact that we don't have that cultivated necessarily,
Yeah.
like generally as a society. I think, I mean, there is a lot of talk about healing and self-love and so on, but I feel it's in the part of the bookstore where it's about self-help, and where it's about new age and so on. But generally speaking, that is not something that you learn as a kid, to cultivate a relationship with yourself, to put yourself first. I mean, there's this analogy, the analogy with the air mask in
Yeah.
airplanes. Like, yeah, if we're going through turbulences and the mask fall down, please help yourself first, then help others, and then help kids, because obviously you need to be well in order
Yeah.
to support others. And I find that to be true in all of life, basically. That if we don't give ourselves the attention first, we are not able to actually help
Yeah.
others properly. And I think that's a mistake that we are usually making, where we're just trying to push through our own troubles and problems and push them aside and let me help others first. But we lose sight of the fact that the quality of support we can give others becomes poorer and poorer
Yep.
over time, and we're not even aware of it, and we're running after trying to fix everything in the environment, try to fix everything in our relationships, trying to keep everybody happy, but putting yourself first, not as an egoistic act, but as an act of altruism,
Mhm.
if you want, so as a necessity of altruism, is not something that's very popular in society, except in New Age, where this has gained some momentum, and people are aware of it. But even there, it's getting dismissed as like spiritual egoism, right? It's like, ah, yeah, okay, of course, those are people who are like circling around themselves, and all they're trying to do is like learn and heal about their own trauma. But I think it's a bit deeper than that. I don't think it is necessarily egoism. I think it's really a critical point that we as a society, at least in the West where I grew up, are missing, and that we need to reintegrate and learn that, and also learn how much better life can be if we're being loving towards ourselves in the same way that we're loving with others.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So I guess one of the things that made this a little bit, and I feel like it's becoming clear is, or more clear as you're kind of, as we're talking through it here, a lot of it is around self-love and sort of an idea that I've been keen on is that we're only capable of loving others as much as we love ourselves. And, so something in what we're kind of talking through, this tendency to be able to take care of others before we take care of ourselves, doesn't quite seem to fit that. But I think that it's, and I don't mean to paint this as like an indictment of anyone who, gets a lot out of helping others or anything. But I think in a lot of ways, our tendency and the ease with which we help others is to some degree an avoidance of our own problems, right? Like if there's somebody that needs help
Mhm.
over there, that is 100% the most effective distraction. Helping someone else is a very good distraction from your own problems. It's a very good way to not look at your own problems. It's a very good way, and it kind of feels good too, because you can be like, well, I'm doing something good at the same time. I don't need to worry about myself so much right now. Myself isn't that important right now. And then of course there is sort of a stigma, as you're kind of mentioning, around self-care and self-love. I think it's very difficult to find and really practice genuine self-love. There's this tendency to make it almost like ego, almost like narcissistic, right? And I think that also kind of pushes us away from genuine self-love, is we're afraid of being narcissistic about it. We're afraid of like, oh, look at how wonderful I am and how much I love myself or something, and seeing that as like an ugly thing, right? And I think honestly, part of it is also just, as I'm going through a lot of this process, part of it is also just learning to actually see yourself as you are, which I recognize, at least for myself, I don't see myself as I am, right? I'm very, well, unfamiliar in a sense, which sounds a little bizarre, but I think maybe we can relate to that a little bit. I'm not very familiar with my actual self, and it's hard to take care of someone that you don't know in a way. So part of it is a journey of self-discovery.
Hmm. Yeah, very true. So, i- if we look at through the Freudian psychological lens of everything we do, all the patterns that we develop is a thing we do to get attention and love from our caregivers. Yeah,
Mhm.
it's very clear that helping others is, one of the easiest mechanisms how to get there. And if you grew up in a household, where that was rewarded, perhaps that was a thing that you do to get love successfully. But there's a difference between just helping other people to distract and not be with yourself, and being of service, because being truly of service, I think you need to get into a position where you can perform the best, and where you also need to perhaps find out first what is actually your purpose. And when you found that purpose, then you can go out and serve people with that purpose, because then you will really serve at your very highest. But it's also true that, and I'm not sure if that quote comes from Jung, I might butcher this, but the quote of people can only meet you as deeply as they met yourself, as they met themselves, I guess, is how it goes. And that is very true. And we know that from experience, right? We connect as deep with other people as we've allowed ourselves to know ourselves, and we have the experience of we cannot connect with some people. We just cannot connect on deep level because perhaps those people did not go on soul searching yet. That is, the discovery of the self is not something they dove into, and you just don't share perhaps some of these interests. And I think that once you go into self discovery, which is part of self love, you open this Pandora's box of existential questions around the question of self, which make you want to connect with people also
Yeah.
on that
Yeah.
level, right? And the connections in turn get deeper. I guess that is one of the benefits of self discovery.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, certainly being on this journey, I'm very interested in meeting people and talking to people on a similar level. And the conversations that I'm interested in having are not like casual conversations. They're not conversations that most people, they're conversations that most people will find very uncomfortable and don't necessarily want to open up in that way. And so, it kind of casts, like, in a sense, it kind of brings a little bit of doubt into your own journey because it can be so difficult to connect with other people over this. Like, kind of going back to this idea of having to give yourself space for your emotions. That's something that society in general is very poor at doing. Other people's emotions tend to be very, like, offensive towards us. We want to make them stop. I mean, I was sharing a little bit of my journey on the phone with the friend the other, and they aren't really in the same headspace. They aren't really in the same journey. And as I was articulating something, a lot of tears were coming, and they could hear me crying through the phone, and you could tell they were kind of trying to get me to stop. Oh, okay, no, it's okay, it's okay, it's okay, right? Like, just that little display of emotion was very uncomfortable for the other person, right? Because it makes them look at these unexamined parts of themselves. It evokes the same thing, right? Like, there's a certain amount of empathetic resonance that happens, and when you're exploring yourself and getting deep into your emotions, other people in your presence are potentially, going to feel that, and they generally, if they're not open to it, they're going to be very repelled by it, which can kind of make your own process more difficult, because then you feel like, acceptance is a very valuable thing, especially when it comes to, emotions and expressing your emotions. And if you're not getting that acceptance, it's very hard for you to accept your own emotions when other people don't.
Generally speaking, emotions are something people get repelled by. I mean, one of the easiest examples that comes to mind for me always is, if I cry in a room when I'm physically with people in a room, you can just see people rushing to get you a tissue and wipe your tears away as if it's something we need to remove immediately and hide, or if it's something shameful. And my reflex nowadays is really like, no, I don't want to wipe my tears away. I don't have a problem with them right now. There's no need for me to wipe them away. So, these kind of reflexes that we have towards emotional reactions is something that needs to stop immediately. It's like a bleeding. We need to stop this process for this person. This person is not stable yet, especially if you go through the process of discovering yourself. Discovering all of these emotions is part of the process. And yeah, as you said, people are not comfortable with that at all. And I would love to get to a state where people are more comfortable with their emotional experience, because not talking about our emotions is seems almost like a denial of, I don't know, I see my emotions as like 30% of the stream of information I get all the time. So what I mean by that is, I get input from my senses, I have my thoughts, and then I have my emotions. So for me, my emotions go on
Yeah.
all the time. It's like 30% of input, and just ignoring them, not talking about it, is almost like denying part
Yeah.
of myself, like as if it doesn't exist. Yet we all have them. It seems so. We don't talk about it often, but it seems that everybody has emotions, except perhaps psychopaths or sociopaths. I'm not sure, but it seems to be a universal experience, but we don't talk about it much, and it's somehow a shameful thing. And the path of self-discovery, or if you're in the path of individuation, as Jung would phrase it, is exactly becoming
Yeah.
authentic and becoming
Yeah.
congruent, right? And I think it's a crucial component to being congruent is being open about your emotions. Like there's nothing more repelling than being with a person that clearly is going through something emotional, denies it, and tries to play or put a mask of a different emotion on top just because they think their situation requires it. This is what we would call incongruence, and this is something which I think everybody can feel. Perhaps people cannot put their finger on what incongruence is exactly, but we're all repelled by it. We're like, okay, this person is not being authentic right now. So if you're on the path of self-discovery, I think that's exactly what needs to change. We need to learn to be comfortable also with unpleasant emotions, and also with sharing that, and being okay with not being okay, and sharing that with other people. But it is a very unusual thing, I
Yeah,
suppose.
yeah, it's interesting how we've kind of found ourselves in this predicament. I mean, like you're saying, essentially we've cut off a third of ourselves, a third of our information, a third of everything that's going on, and that could be really useful information. It can help you make better decisions. It can help you navigate life much more effectively. And societally, culturally, we've pretty much cut that off, and you know it continually brings to mind this question of like, okay, well, if we're doing it wrong, what does it look like when you're doing it right? And the first thing that really comes to mind for me is like everyone learning to hold space. And it really brings up this idea that being able to simply be present with someone who's going through intense, uncomfortable emotions is a very challenging thing to do. I mean, it's like potentially as challenging as meditation or something, sitting there in discomfort and not reacting to it compulsively by like trying to comfort them because you're uncomfortable, right? And it's not to say that you shouldn't comfort somebody that's going through something difficult. It's to say, question what your motivation is. Is your motivation, this is making me really uncomfortable. I'm not okay with what's happening, and I need that person's emotions to change, so I'm going to go comfort them? Or is it coming from like a genuine place of actually being connected to yourself and really, really feeling what they're going through, like at an empathic level, and maybe offering them something that you really feel that they need, and it's not coming from this place of like trying to get somebody to stop crying or something. I mean, I know certainly as guys, there's this a lot of stigma around, especially like crying or having any emotions. And boy, we would be so much better off as a society just in general. I mean, I can't even imagine how impactful that would be if those things started becoming acceptable, and it became like, the honorable thing to do is to hold space for other people and not try to, not try to stop what's going on within them.
Yeah, I assume the missed opportunity there is also that we are able to help each other out, and the fact that we all isolate in our own experiences, we cut ourselves off, makes us think that we need to deal with these
Yeah.
things on our own. Yet, we have naturally the ability to
Yeah.
regulate each other, right? So if I'm going through an intense emotion, let it be anxiety or whatever, if I speak about it, there's the opportunity that somebody can co-regulate me, and I think that's something we also just
Yeah.
dismiss, even though we all know on at least on a subconscious level that this is what is happening when we connect with people, and it's a bit of a missed opportunity, and I don't exactly know why. It seems that somehow there is some kind of shamefulness around emotions, and I don't know exactly where that comes from. I mean, you pointed out that it's especially a guy's thing, or at least for men it is especially unattractive to display our emotions, perhaps because of our role in society in the past, but also in general. I think also for women it's also not super called for to be emotional, but yeah, I'm not sure where that
Yeah,
comes
that's
from.
true. I suppose, to some degree, it's seen as an inconvenience. It's, living in a very sort of male dominated, patriarchal, masculine society that really values the material, it really values productivity, right? It values creation. Things like emotions are just maybe seen as an obstacle to that, something to be overcome in a sense, right? Some sort of weakness, rather than like really integrating them and seeing them as something that is potentially like an inspiration of that creative force, right? So yeah, honestly, I mean, there's like, as I'm kind of talking through it with you now, I see that there's so much value, there's so much potential in reconnecting with our emotions. There's so much, I mean, there's so much information, there's so much motivation there, really. I mean, if you look at it, it's our emotions that are pushing us, that are kind of motivating us in one way or another. And I mean, maybe call it feelings, maybe be a little bit more general with it so that we aren't, caught up in the specific realm of emotion, right? But it's this internal pressure that pushes you a certain direction. And what an amazing life we could have if that pressure were something that we could kind of work with, that we could like harness and like, hey, I want to do this, but I don't have the motivation to do it. Can I work with my emotions in such a way that I feel really motivated to do this thing? Or maybe there's something that I know that I need to do and I feel very, averse. I feel like I really don't want to do it. Again, can I work with my emotions to move through that resistance so that then that, the motivation that I really need to do things starts to appear, right? I mean, I think in a way we kind of develop patterns or habits of the way that things motivate us. And some of them are, more functional in terms of working in society than others, right? Like if you really value achievement or ambition or something, that those can be really helpful. But there's also sort of this other side of what we're missing, right? When we're overly focused on anything, really any habit is essentially a limitation, right?
Interesting question would be, can we elicit emotions on purpose or feelings? Right? So can you feel happy just on purpose, or can you feel a specific emotion just on purpose? It's sort of something that happens to us, right, through circumstance. Yet I do think that we have influence to some degree on it, but in order to have influence on it, we need to be really aligned and on a certain path that is truly fulfilling. At least in my experience, that's like the only way where I can like predictably reproduce emotions that I want. And the alternative path would be to ignore my emotions, right? So if I'm doing something that is not really purposeful, that elicits also in turn
Mm.
negative emotions. And the solution to that is to numb myself. And that this is a path that is pretty functional, and I think that people go down a lot of the time. And it's also a path I have been down on, right? Have been going down on. And there's so many tools in society that we can use to sort of stay on that path of suppressing certain emotions. And I'm talking about uh, numbing yourself. I'm talking about like substance abuse. I'm talking about addictions, food addictions, and these kind of things. The ways we have to numb or mute certain emotions. But the reality is that while we do have the feeling that we have a grip on it and we can control our emotions with these tools, it's it's not really functioning in the long run, and we are bottling up emotions. And I don't think it can work really although I mean there's examples obviously where people decide to not face their emotions, suppress certain emotions for the whole life. In my personal experience, I don't think I would be able to suppress it for all of my life. That's why it's probably a bad choice to go and suppress these emotions, and instead it's probably a good idea to start listening to your internal escape and start to allow even uncomfortable and negative emotions, because if we suppress them for long enough, they become this force that then in turn controls us. Because after some time we have become so unfamiliar with those emotions, it has become a thing that we avoid so much that avoiding it is now the
Yeah.
mission, right? And then that can drive your life in a way that my number one priority is I need to be always in a state where certain
Yeah.
emotions don't surface. And I think this is something that can drive people into addiction, into like toxic relationships. God knows, how people solve that problem. But yeah, and the better approach would be, I suppose, start going in the other direction, and that's also part of self
Yeah,
discovery.
yeah. Well, when we've talked about this a little bit before. I forget what episode, but this idea of control and fear, right? Like,
Mhm.
what's coming up now is that hmm, one of the things that makes emotions so difficult is a lack of control, right? It is sort of like a fear of what if this emotion pushes me in a direction that's not in alignment with my expectations of my life, right? It's almost like we have to, I mean, this is certainly one of the sources of the need, the desire to kind of control our emotions, is like, what happens if I'm trying to do something in my life, or I have this idea about how my life should be, and my emotion is pushing me in the opposite direction? That emotion suddenly becomes like a really inconvenient thing. Can I, you know, it's, in a sense, it's kind of asking you to change. It's asking you to change your course and push you in a different direction. And there's we have this tendency of kind of needing to know what direction we're going. We need to, well, I've got my life planned out, and this emotion doesn't fit in with it, or something along those lines, right? Like, emotions can just be very inconvenient, and it can make it difficult to control. But as you were mentioning, eventually, if you keep going down the path of controlling emotions and being afraid of them, eventually it's going to start coming out in such a way that it's controlling you, and that maybe some of your fears around how your emotions would manifest, it is manifesting that way, because now it's like totally, you're just totally out of the picture. You've suppressed all of this energy, and now it's coming up one way or another. I think that's how people end up in, you know I mean, we talk about things like temporary insanity, or, people almost like losing consciousness. They're not able to control themselves anymore because of this, inner pressure of repressed emotions, right? Which, that, of course, that's an extreme case, but I think that we all are, to some degree, under the influence of repressed emotions, right? They're having an effect on us.
Another example that comes to mind, I was looking for the English word for it. In German, it's called a Zwangsstörung, which would be
Mm,
obligation disorders. So, and that would be, for
mm,
example,
mm.
OCD, right? Obsessive compulsive disorders. I think that this might be the mechanism of action there. That the mind, if you bottle up the emotion that much that it really becomes this thing that we are also unable to deal with, because by that time it has become so large to deal with that we would just be overwhelmed if we turn towards that. that the mind now comes up with all kinds of strategies of how to avoid it. And in some cases, they become
Yeah.
compulsive and they become obsessive if we want to do it through a longer stretch of time. And yeah, it's really sad that all these disorders develop seemingly because we did not pay attention to simple information that is flowing through our nervous system and that wants to give us simple information, just bring some things to our attention. Yet we have this attitude of, no, I want to choose what I feel. I decline certain feelings. I am uncomfortable with X, Y, and Z, and I only want to feel A, B, and C. Yeah, it's very typical thing of the Western mind, I assume, to live this illusion of we need to be in control of our internal experience, which obviously is, I think it's not possible. It's also a battle that we cannot really win.
Yeah, yeah, and it can be hard to accept that, right? Because as I was saying earlier, we've got all these ideas about how our lives should look and how things should be, and when it's not matching up with that, it can be kind of difficult to just go with the flow, kind of allow yourself to get blown around a little bit. It can be pretty scary because you don't know what direction you ended up heading, right? I mean, personally, I'm kind of going through a little of that around my job. Like I'm trying to allow these things to process and come out, and I don't know what things look like on the other side, right? I don't know if it ends up pushing me in a totally different direction and I have to leave my job or something. And that's, it's really challenging. It's, in a sense, it's very impractical. But ultimately, I've at least convinced myself that I've been doing the more practical thing my entire life, and it didn't get me where I wanted to go. I'm still in the same predicament of, you know, essentially projecting my discomfort out onto the world. And then my mind is telling me how the world needs to be, right? Kind of taking a step back to what you were talking about just previously around like OCD or any of these other, you should call them symptoms of repressed emotion, is essentially when there's something that you really don't want to feel, your mind is kind of in overdrive. Like, okay, how can I help you avoid that? What are the strategies? What are the tactics that we can do? And then, you know, potentially you buy into that and you end up doing something compulsively over and over and over again. And it's really just an avoidance of this emotion, right? But of course, we don't necessarily see it that way. Right, and it's interesting, as you do get more in touch with anything that's kind of repressed. I mean, there is a lot of fear, and it is very uncomfortable. But as it starts to lighten, I've found a lot of those tendencies, they get a lot less pushy. They don't really demand your attention as much. The mind tends to quiet down when it doesn't have an emotional problem to solve. I don't know if you found similar in your
Yeah.
experience.
Yeah, of course. I mean, this is also a thing we can practice, right? So this gets easier over time. I think in the beginning, if we had a really long habit of not paying attention to it and then we turn towards it, then in the beginning it can feel like this really big beast, the dragon that needs to be slayed, and it seems unfamiliar, it seems dangerous, it seems like this big task. But once you start going down the path and you've dealt with a couple of really uncomfortable emotions, you realize pretty quickly that they're most of the time just like hot
Yeah.
air. So they cannot really harm you at the end. They're perhaps associated with some painful memories that you will feel like you will at least maybe relive some of the pain associated with them, which is creating some of the resistance. So yeah, it is a bit difficult in the beginning, but I think once we get practice with it, it does get better, and it's not that difficult actually after one. And I think it's much easier to live in a state of regular attention to your emotional life, and you realize that an emotion gets stuck or you're avoiding it, and doing it right then and there, or at least pretty soon, is much easier than the whole thing we're doing with, let me shove this down, let me avoid this, and then let me deal with it later, and then later never comes because we always have something better to do. At least for me, that strategy hasn't worked out really, although my mind is trying to convince me that that's the way to go. But it's a really shitty strategy, and I have the feeling that a lot of people follow it. And then we get ourselves in situations where it's like, now I need to take a break. Like now I need to go to Vipassana retreat for like 10 days to sit with this shit, in order to be able to like face it properly, which is obviously inconvenient. Yeah, we need to stop working, and it actually comes to the point where it requires like all of our focus, like, right?
Yeah.
You get into a situation where it's like you should do this like full time for, I don't know, a week or something to make some actual progress. But even that should be, in my opinion,
Yeah.
non-negotiable, like, because that's the thing that you need to do. Like the only way out is through, in that case, right? And yeah, maybe postpone it to a time where, perhaps it's a bit more convenient, or whatever. But that you're doing it should be non-negotiable, right? But yet it's like we need to negotiate with ourselves, like, can I really take the time off right now to deal with this thing? But it's, in fact, it's as imminent as any kind of infection or illness that you're having, right? And there you don't ask the question. It's just the body gives you the signals, and like, yeah, okay, I need to rest right now. Like, this is the only way. And I think it should be the same with difficult emotional material emerging. It's like you need to face it. It's not a question of yes or no. It's a question of when,
Yeah,
basically.
yeah, I really like that. I think, one of the things that we're suffering is we're not putting enough importance on, call it emotional processing, call it whatever, but not putting enough importance on taking the time to work through things like that. And honestly, not even all that well equipped to be able to work through it. I mean, I'm sure there are folks listening that are like, I don't even know what you're talking about when you're telling me to take time to process emotions. What does that look like? How do you do that? Right? And these are things that, honestly, I mean, we should be taught this kind of first thing, like being human 101, right? You have emotions. This is, as you were saying, a third of your life, and this is how to work with those. And what an incredible paradigm shift it could be to start to see something like emotions as a gift, right? Like, we can start to harness this and use this. I mean, not to desecrate it or pervert it too much here, right? But you could use emotions in a sense once you become, I go back to the sailing analogy, right? It's like, in a sense, the emotions are the wind, right? It's blowing one way or another. You can't really do much about it, but you got to kind of catch it in your sail. You got to kind of like feel it. That's the catching it in your sail is the feeling it and allowing it. And initially it might kind of blow you over a few times because you're not really, very seasoned in terms of how to do that. But eventually, you can sail. You can move in pretty much any direction you want to once you can feel it. But if you can't feel it, you're just getting blown every which way, and you're confused and you don't know how to navigate. And I think in a lot of ways that's what emotions are. They're like the wind, and they can be at your back. They can, or you can sail any direction if you can really just feel with it, right? And you can use them for creativity, and it's kind of good stuff.
Yeah, I mean, this image I have in my mind would be that ultimately I would like to reach. I'm totally fine with feeling any way,
Yeah.
basically, right? I mean, what I imagine really as fulfillment would be if I'm going through an emotional rut, or if I'm going through grief, or if I'm going through anxiety, yet being fully present, yet not dissociating, yet just being there and feeling it, not turning away. And honestly, I think this is like one of the obstacles I see to presence and being in the moment. What pushes people out of the moment is perhaps unpleasant
Yeah.
emotions. And it's, as we already said, it's obviously a matter of practice. But I see somehow that the purpose is exactly that, not curate our emotions and only wait until, the dopamine comes again and we feel happy. No, but also to feel present in moments of
Yeah.
boredom, sadness, awkwardness, take it all in and just be okay with it and not be not get weirded out by it. So if we stay with
Mm.
the weather analogy, you know, if it rains, you could stand there and enjoy the rain, because there's also some enjoyable parts to rain or strong wind, right? There's also something nice, refreshing, cleansing about it. Or you could immediately, rush and try to get cover and go in the house and go back to comfort, and I think it's a giving analogy in that sense, because I see people treating the weather exactly like that, which is always funny to me that people try to avoid bad weather like hell. But honestly, I also
Sure.
enjoy bad weather, right? Sometimes it can be nice, and I would love the same for my emotional life. That I'm just fine with whatever the wind is blowing at me that day. And yeah, I guess this is a matter of practice until we
Yeah,
get there.
yeah. I think one of the biggest things for me in terms of learning to work with emotions, probably almost, and it's still probably the most important aspect for me, and that's not blaming, right? Not blaming the way that I feel on some sort of outside circumstance, because that right there, you pretty much just lost the game once you start doing that. I mean, of course, we feel justified. We feel like, well, of course, I should feel this way in that situation, or this person's wrong, or anything. But that's just going to get caught up in more mind stuff. It's just going to be your mind's just going to run and give you ideas of what you should do, but it's never going to address the fact that you're not okay feeling that emotion, right? Like sometimes you can even see it as, well, this is a really good opportunity to start to shift my relationship to this emotion, right? And I, you know, I've had experiences where even some of the most challenging emotions can take on almost like this kind of beautiful, this sweet quality when it's not resisted. I have this idea that the discomfort from any emotion is really just our resistance towards feeling the emotion. When you totally let it in, when you totally allow it, it seems like almost every emotion is just kind of bliss. Like they're all bliss. Anger, anxiety is bliss in disguise, and we're just resisting it. Um, but it's also like maybe a really intense one, right? So I don't mean to trivialize anything here. This is kind of high level talk in a way.
Yeah, but so we had this discussion today at psychology class where somebody was speaking about like ending a relationship and how that is inevitably painful. And then somebody else said that, like, why would it need to be painful to separate with somebody, that in a sense it is possible to part ways from a long lasting relationship without pain, right? That it could be the case of like people are separating and that there's no suffering. And I think that could be an interesting example of what you're saying. And I didn't really have like fully an answer, but what do you think? Is I mean, I guess like you're describing, it would be exactly the case, right? So if you're going through a breakup and you're also fully allowing yourself to just feel everything and you're not in resistance with it, I guess it could be sort of in a way a
Yeah,
nice experience,
yeah,
right?
yeah. Well, Michael Singer says some stuff around this a lot that I think goes well with this conversation. He says that our emotions are like the soundtrack to a movie, right? I mean, you wouldn't cut out the sad part of the soundtrack because it goes along so well. It adds like depth, it adds texture to the experience. And when we're able to experience it sort of, I don't know if detached is quite the right word, but where we're experiencing where it's not like a personal offense in a way, then something like sadness or grief over the end of a relationship can be a very beautiful thing. It can be an expression of the love that was felt in that relationship. It can be an expression of all of all that you're leaving behind, and it doesn't necessarily have to have like this negative tinge to it of something that you're trying to avoid. It can almost be like a celebration. And that's not to say that so-called negative emotions, sadness or anxiety, it's not to say that they are easy necessarily, but they can take on like this very beautiful texture where it's just, it's just another flavor. It's just another note that can be played, on the human heart. It's kind of an analogy I've been thinking through a lot recently in terms of how to relate to my emotions, as I see it as, you know, emotions are just chords or just different notes that the instrument of my heart can play. And when I don't mute certain notes, then it's like a harmony. It's like a beautiful soundtrack. But when there are certain things that I don't want to feel, then it really messes up the music. It becomes more of a cacophony. It becomes more dissonant, right? Because certain notes are just muted because I'm not willing to feel those things, and so my heart can't play its song in a way.
It's a really nice image, actually, to think about emotions. I'm almost tempted to make that the end image of this
Sounds good to
episode.
me.
All right.